Welcome to this conversation with Diana Chambers, the Family Wealth Mentor. I'm your host, David Bell, founder of PCD Club. PCD has run events all around the world since 2014, including in Cape Town and Johannesburg. Diana Chambers is committed to helping her clients manage their wealth in emotionally intelligent ways. She provides guidance to key families on communication, talking about money, engaging with the next generation, and helping people find their purpose and live happier lives. Diana can bring huge experience dealing with clients and her own circumstances over many years. Diana, it's great to talk to you today. Perhaps you could explain a little bit more about your practice.
Thanks, David. So there are two dimensions to my practice. The first is as a family wealth mentor, as you already mentioned. And so in that space, I am working with my clients, whether they're multi-generational families or individual family members, to help them to own their wealth with ease and confidence. And from that position to be able to make very conscious choices about how they spend, how they save, how they give, etc. And I look at that as financial emotional intelligence as opposed to financial cognitive intelligence. So I'm focused on what is my client's relationship to money? How are other people relating to them because of their wealth? And how do they talk constructively about their wealth, specifically in intimate relationships? There are also other dimensions such as negotiating over wealth or resolving conflicts over wealth. But the three primary ones are, what's my relationship with money? How do others relate to me because of it? And how do I talk about it constructively?
Because money could be a great source of tension and stress amongst the family, aren't there? What are the things that really keep your clients awake at night? What do you help them with? How do you help them alleviate that stress?
The number one topic that I think is pretty universal is whether or not the wealth is actually going to be of benefit and a genuine resource to their children, or whether in some way it might pull their children off track. Many parents are concerned whether too much wealth too young will disincentivize their children. So they might potentially lose motivation in terms of, will they get traction with a career? So I've got a story that I can tell about this because I used to live in Washington, D.C. and I had a very dear friend with whom I would go on morning walks. And she was a person of very significant wealth. And she had no concerns whatsoever about her children and their relationship to money because she knew she'd done a great job parenting them. And she was very confident about their values. In parallel, I had a client there who lived about a half mile away from this friend and whose husband, who had not come from wealth, had said to their children, "Don't worry, you'll never have to work." And the result was 3 adult children, none of whom were working, but who were all still living at home. So it really reflects how the financial parenting is done and what financial messages are given to children. So that's absolutely the number one concern, always. Number two is often about succession issues, which has some of the same elements of how will this wealth influence my children, but also in terms of the succession is then who will be leading that? How will the next generation govern themselves? Are there any existing concerns or potential rifts in the next generation? What do we need to be very thoughtful about when we're passing on this wealth? And then there are a myriad of other topics that people can find quite challenging, such as marrying into wealth, or whether or not people are choosing to be in relationship with you because you are wealthy, which really means that you need to have a pretty refined emotional and relational sense to be able to gauge, is this a genuine friendship or not? And then there's another topic that happens, and often in specific cultures, I've noticed it, where there's a large expectation that next generation family members will work in any existing family business. So I once had one client who asked me if all of their children needed to get an MBA. That's not necessarily going to be appropriate for every child, but there was such a push toward being in the family business that was the question that they asked.
You think, are there differences between first generation wealth creators and how they transmit their wealth subsequently versus those who are inheriting a family enterprise that has been in train for many years? I mean, what's your experience in the different types of clients you might deal with and how that impacts their view of their wealth?
Yes, for sure, there are differences. And one of the big ones that I would highlight is that first generation wealth creators have no models for how the passing down of wealth might happen, because they're the ones who created it. And so it's brand new territory for them. When you get down several generations in a family of wealth, there's more experience, there are more, there have been more opportunities to see the impact of the wealth transitions. But when you're the first wealth creator, you literally don't know what you don't know. And that's one of the reasons why I sometimes work with wealth creators, because they say, this is a maze, I don't know my way through it, please help.
And they're also very concerned about if they've not grown up around a lot of wealth, they're concerned, they've no idea what impact that might have on their children. And without governance structures in place, it's likely to go awry, isn't it? So that I can understand that they're needing a lot of input if they find themselves in a position of huge wealth.
Right.
But communication is key, isn't it, in all of this? I mean, how do you find that conversations about money are complex amongst all families, even with a modest level of wealth, let alone a huge amount? So how do you find that you can create that dialogue, that space to talk? What are some of the issues there?
I think the first and best line of defense in any challenges in families of wealth is the ability to talk constructively about the wealth. But again, most of us were never taught how to do that. Even in the families that are multi-generational wealth holders, they did not necessarily learn or be taught this skill. And then there's the added complexity that many people are really concerned about initiating money conversations because the stakes are very high, especially when they're close family members. And they're afraid that they could damage a relationship or even at worst lose a relationship. So one, they don't feel equipped, and two, they're concerned about the consequences. So people tend to avoid money conversations. But having said that, I actually teach on this because I think it's such an important skill, and I've broken it down into multiple steps. So I could just run through those very rapidly because I think it might be interesting to our audience. The first one, which seems apparent, but it isn't always clear, is what exactly do you want to talk about? People may have a sort of fuzzy idea of what the topic is, but it's really good as the person who's initiating the conversation to get very clear. What is it I want to communicate? Second is, who am I? What am I bringing to the table in this conversation around money? And that requires some fairly nuanced work to really get conscious about who we are. And we could speak more about that later if it's helpful. And then to be very curious about the other party or parties to the conversation. Who are they? What has shaped them? What is their relationship to money? Curiosity is a really key point here, because we think that we know pretty much everything there is to know about the people who we're close to, but we all change, and we all evolve, and we might even change on a daily basis. So don't go into a conversation thinking you already know the other person fully. Now, this is a really important point. Invite the other person to have a conversation. Don't assume that they want to have it. So initiate and say, I would really like to talk to you about whatever the money topic is. Will you have this conversation? And you have to be open to hearing no, because for them, it may be too early, or they may not yet have processed their concerns about having the conversation. So be willing to hear no and wait till the opportune moment. But hopefully they'll say yes. And at that point, you can then set up the conversation. First point is to do it in a peaceful and unhurried space. In other words, set aside the time where you will be uninterrupted. No children will be coming in and disturbing you. No phones will be ringing. And you can take as long as you need to have this conversation. You've not squeezed it into a 30-minute slot that you had in your schedule. One way to look at this is don't do this in the evening after dinner when you've had wine to drink. Choose a place so that it's conducive to a successful conversation. And then when you're actually talking, do it in a very thoughtful, reflective manner. So if you're not 100% sure what the other person said to you, speak back to them along the following lines and say, I believe you said ABC. Is this correct? So that you clarify the real intention.
What do you think if there's a mismatch in expectations? For example, if there's a younger person who wants to inherit faster than the parents think is desirable, and they want to be living a lifestyle that's outside of what their existing means are, but they know there is substantial resources waiting for them in trusts and structures and businesses, but there's decision making that needs to go on before that. If you're being open and talking and having that discussion, does that create problems or address problems? Because actually you can get to the heart of it at that point and get expectations settled in the right way. What's your take on that difficult issue?
Yeah, it's really one that does come up fairly regularly. And I recently had a client who had had a very challenging conversation with his father because he wanted to clarify what the expectations were around structure and timing so he could do his own planning. A very legitimate reason. But the way the conversation unfolded was that the father felt like the son was actually being greedy and entitled by asking these questions. And so in the same way that I hear from parents that they're concerned about can their children handle wealth, I also hear from children, I don't like initiating these conversations because I don't want to appear greedy or grasping, but I really do need to understand because I need to plan.
No, that's very interesting. And I mean, it comes to a broader point about our relationship with money. I know this is an area that you've looked at and written on. I mean, perhaps you could set out or tell us a little bit more about how you see people form a relationship with money and what that means for the way they live their life.
Absolutely. Before I do that, David, I want to throw in the final point about having the conversation, which is that once you've had this reflective conversation where you've listened actively, summarize whatever it is that you have, the two of you said and agreed to. And it doesn't have to be, a formal document summarizing. It could literally be as simple as a text message, but make sure that you put in writing somewhere the core point or points that came out of the conversation, because in 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, you'll have different recollections. So that's the last point on the conversations. Now, to go to how money shapes us. Again, I mentioned curiosity earlier. I would say that there are two other values that are very important when we do this work, exploring our relationship with money, and as we're anticipating how somebody else may be relating to money if we're in conversation with them. So in addition to curiosity, I always encourage compassion, because each one of us is doing the best we possibly can. And often we weren't taught these things, so we don't know how to do anything any better. So curiosity and compassion, and then to recognize it actually takes courage to do this work. So those are my 3 C's: curiosity, compassion, courage. Now, how does the relationship with money get formed? Obvious ones, the first big one is money messages and belief systems. So I gave one example earlier about the father who said, don't worry, you'll never have to work. That's a very strong money message, and it shaped the behavior of his children. And if we look at money messages, we've all received them. I got two very powerful ones from my father. One was never be in debt, and the other one was always be the first to pay for anything. Those were the primary ones. And they have really shaped my relationship to money. I've had to really unpack them to change my relationship to money as I've matured and as I've seen it differently.
You think that not having to work is a liberating feeling, in a sense of, in a sense, you could do whatever passion you want to pursue, or does it leave people feeling more adrift because that is not the experience of, you know, the vast bulk of the population? To take away that purpose of simply providing for yourself and your family, I mean, how do you see that as liberating, or actually, you know, more burdensome in a sense of having to discover that purpose?
You hit it right on, that it is about purpose. And I don't know if you ever saw the film Born Rich by Jamie Johnson, the heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune. And he was trying to figure out what he was going to do, because of course he didn't actually need to work, but he wanted to. And one of the people that he consulted with when he was starting potentially to build a collection of old documents and maps said to him, well, if you don't need to work, why work? You know, and that's what a number of people would think. But work is an incredibly important form of expression and of accomplishment and purpose and, you know, so much more. So the message, don't worry, you won't have to work, would have been much better if it had been tightly crafted and along the lines of, don't worry, whatever work you choose to do, whatever income comes with it, you will be supported. You know, and this is the thing about money messages. They tend to be given in very absolute terms, with a never or a must or a don't or something in there, but they're much more nuanced than that. So I work a lot with parents about the messages that they're giving to their kids. And is that the message they actually want to give? Should they refine it a bit? Should they eliminate it? Is there a different message?
And are we also talking about not just obviously what you say, but what you do? You know, it's the way you explain how the wealth is one thing, but actually all of your actions as well add up to something, don't they? So is money message also about, I imagine it's a balance of actions and words, isn't it?
Totally. Money messages are not only verbal, but behavioral as well. So as you're speaking, I immediately come up with two thoughts. One is, you know, we might look at our children and think they've got enough toys, but how many toys do we have? You know, do we have jets, boats, cars, what have you? So it's very hard to limit your child when you yourself are playing with many toys. And I also remember once when I was speaking to a delightful man who was probably like late 40s, maybe 50, had teenage children, and he'd been extremely successful and he no longer needed to work. And his question, which was very sensitive, was, how much longer do I need to keep working as a model for my children? So yes, it's definitely about behavior as well as words.
Fascinating. But then moving on, I mean, there's other important things that help form our relationship with money. Perhaps you could give us a little bit more on some of the other aspects.
Yes. So I would introduce this second aspect by saying that whatever anyone does or says about money makes complete sense to them, given their life experience. And the piece of life experience that I have been looking into deeply in the last couple of years, especially, is whether or not we have been in any way traumatized. And if I do a straw poll, if I'm speaking and I say to the audience, how many of you would say you are traumatized? Typically, you know, maybe 20, maybe 30% of the people might put up their hands. And in my worldview, every single one of us has experienced some trauma somewhere. None of us is exempt. So I'll just do a little sidebar on trauma so people have a little understanding of it. But there are three primary categories of trauma. One of them is ancestral, what gets passed down to us through the generations. So you could think hypothetically of parents or grandparents who've gone through world wars or other genocides, and how that has impacted them, and the impact of that has been shown to be passed down through the DNA. Collective, what happens to a whole group of people? You could think hypothetically of climate migrants. Some massive fire happens. We've just been looking at the wildfires on Hawaii. And many people are now homeless, and the island has been very severely affected. That's a collective trauma. And then we've got individual traumas, which can be like small t traumas, little bit drip, 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 that happens over a long period of time, or more significant individual traumas. So, for example, I had a very severe ski accident about 5 years ago. That really was a trauma in my system. So there are different sorts of trauma that happens, and our relationship to money reflects that. So there are three primary symptoms of trauma. Scarcity. You might think of people who hoard or who are greedy or who fight over money in that regard. Separation. And in that one, you might think about people who hide money or keep secrets or lie about it, or who let money slip through their fingers very fast, or potentially give it all away. And then absence. People who are excessively, have excessive consumer behavior, or they're exceptionally frugal, or people who waste resources. So my premise is that if we look at our relationship to money, it can point back to underlying trauma, and we can then heal that and change our relationship with money at the same time. So I think that trauma is a very big influence on our relationship with money, but it's not one that has been very well explored to this point.
And you've explored it in some detail with an essay that's on your homepage, which everyone is available to read freely. But perhaps you could give us some of the key points, the key takeaways from that essay.
Well, that money is really, our relationship with money, even if we find it challenging, is a gift to us, because it can point us, should we choose to look at it, to whatever is the foundational reason for our behavior. And if our relationship with money is not really satisfactory to us, then isn't it great that we have an opportunity to shift and change that? So I see money as an incredible guide and teacher, and I believe that this is a lens that can be very helpful to people.
Okay, and for those watching this down in South Africa as part of Anne's conference, I mean, what are some of the key takeaways from our discussion that we've just had now, and where should people go to sort of find out more if they have a client who they think is in need of some help and guidance in terms of their relationship with money?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I would say is that handling money skillfully in our relationships is not rocket science. Just from the way that I described how you can have a successful money conversation, you can see that things can be broken down into a very step-by-step process. And the challenge is that we tend to get in our own ways. So what I say often is that the foundational building block for a successful relationship with money and handling money skillfully in your relationships is what I call relational health. And that starts with each one of us. How present are we to ourselves? How connected are we to ourselves? Is there anything we need to heal? Is there any skill we need to build? If we're willing to do this work, it will so facilitate an easy relationship with money. And as wealth holders, I believe it's our responsibility to do this work. And the more family members who do it, the more conscious and aware each family member becomes, so that the financial choices are consciously made, not reactive, but thoughtfully done. then the easier it will be for the family to manage their wealth. So that's my key takeaway. It's about you being the best you can be and bringing the best of yourself to the relationship with money in your family.
Well, Diana, thank you for talking to me today. It's been a really fascinating chat, and we look forward to sharing this interview.
Thank you so much.